Happy holidays, everyone. It's that time of year. I'm brewing Feats of Strength. It's a beer I've made before on this channel. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about everything that I do after the brew when I make my beers. And that all starts now. Welcome to Big Monster Brewing, the Anvil Foundry Edition. I am Matt. And in this episode, I am making my annual Festivus Ale called Feats of Strength that I serve throughout the entire holiday season and beyond. If you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell, especially if you're interested in brewing and recipes and techniques using the smaller 6.5 Anvil Foundry. That is what I feature most, if not solely, on this channel. This is not the first time I've brewed this beer on this channel. So in this year's version of this episode, I'm going to talk about the things I do after brewing. Most of my videos feature up to the point of pitching the yeast. And I was going to say, I don't talk about what I do after. I actually do. That's the thing. I talk about it. I don't show it. So we're going to run through the brew process really quick for this and then concentrate on the post-fermentation steps, the things that I have not talked about on this show much at all. So I'm going to do a real quick run through of the brew, like I said. But if you haven't seen this episode before or the previous episode of this and want a more detailed look at how this beer is brewed, I will put a link to the video. I think it's here. I always guess wrong, so if you're not seeing it here, it's here. Somewhere in one of these corners, it says the Feats of Strength link that I was talking about. So let's get through that, what we're going to call it, fast forward, the cliff notes of the Feats of Strength brew. I'm making a 2.5 gallon batch on the 6.5 gallon Anvil Foundry, and I start with 3.5 gallons of water. I turn on the foundry, I get the strike temperature up to 152 degrees, and I start the water recirculation and get my grist together. That grist starts off with 6 pounds, 4 ounces of pale two-row, then my specialty malts of 2.5 ounces of Belgian Special B, 2.5 ounces of brown malt, and 1.5 ounces of Carafa 2. I get those malts together and run them through the mill. When the strike water is up to temperature, I mash in a very thick and delicious smelling mash. I recirculate during the entire 60-minute mash and get 1 gallon of sparge water heated up to 170 degrees. Now I have time to get my boil additions ready, starting with 25 IBUs of Columbus hops at 60 minutes, 19 IBUs of Columbus at 20 minutes, and a couple specialty items, starting with 5 ounces of Brewing at 10 minutes. This is where the recipe differs from the last video. Last video I used Brewing. This time I meant to use Brewing, but I accidentally picked up Brewing, which is the darker version of that Belgian soft sugar. So I'm going to use it. I didn't realize until brew day, but since it is a dark, richer sugar, I'm only using half the amount that I used in the first recipe, and we'll see if that makes a difference here in this episode. For that Festivus kick, I prep 0.25 ounces of sweet orange peel that I'll add at 5 minutes, and then finally 0.15 of mulling spices that I'll add at flame out and continue to steep as I cool the wort. And as with almost all of my beers, I have the usual additions of yeast nutrients at 10 minutes and a bit of Rolflock at 2 minutes. During the last 10 minutes of the mash, I raise the temperature to 168 degrees for a 10-minute mash out, and at the end of the mash, I remove the malt pipe and sparge with that 1 gallon of 170-degree water, and I set the foundry to boil. Once the boil gets going, I start my timer and I add my first hop addition. 30 minutes later, I add my second hop addition, and 10 minutes later, I add the yeast nutrients. We're almost done with the brewing process, but we're at a part of something in this I've not talked about in great detail before. I've talked about adding my immersion chiller at 10 minutes, but I haven't talked about the immersion chiller that I'm using now. I've switched from the provided stainless steel coil that came with the foundry to the tri-coil all-in-one from Cuss Brewing. And this is a fantastic change. I've always defended that I could chill the wort with the one provided from Anvil in a relatively decent time, short enough time I was comfortable putting the wort into my fermentation fridge to drop it to the final pitching temperature. But this is kind of an apples and orange comparison. What this immersion chiller can do from Cuss Brewing as opposed to that. Price point wise, it's not terribly expensive. It's not the cheapest thing to buy in brewing, of course, but it's also not as expensive as the foundry itself and a few other things you might have in your serving vessels or fermentation and whatnot. So if you haven't checked this out, chances are you may have, but if you're new to this hobby and new to the Anvil Foundry, check it out at Cuss Brewing. I am a little upset I waited so long to use this because it has just saved so much time and gotten things so cold so fast. So back to the brew, I add the Brew Fonce first by dissolving it with some wort so it doesn't hit the bottom of the kettle and scorch, and then I pour the mixture into the kettle. I follow that with the sweet orange peel addition, and in the last 2 minutes I put in a whirl flock and start filling the chill water bucket. Finally at flame out, I add those mulling spices. All right, let's get back to the chilling process. Now that I've introduced the immersion chiller I'm using, let's take a little look at what goes into pushing the water through that, because of course it just doesn't work by putting in the Anvil Foundry alone. I use an off-the-shelf $40 quarter horsepower sub pump in a bucket of water, and as you can see from this video, that is enough power to push water through that 75 feet of copper tubing at a pretty good rate. I stir the wort to help the chilling process, and as you can see in this clip, it drops pretty fast. Once I get the temperature below 100 degrees, I add water to the bucket. I'm in Central Florida. Our tap water rarely drops below the high 70s, so this is an additional purchase I need when I chill my wort. This is nothing new. I had to do this with the provided Anvil chiller as well. And between that ice water and that pump still pushing that cold water through, the temperature is still dropping, and it's not terribly long until I hit and pass that pitching temperature. Typically, I can get this under 20 minutes. It's about 17 or 18 on an average. Now that I'm at pitching temperature, I get a 3-gallon better bottle carboy ready, and I've not talked about these particular carboys, these square ones. I use them for a specific reason, which we're going to see soon. But before we get to that, I do add a little bit of firm cap in the bottom to kind of control the foaming that's going to happen as I transfer the wort into this vessel. After transferring the wort, I am just under 3 gallons, and that is the exact amount I wanted from this batch. At this point, I put a rubber stopper on top of the carboy, and I give it a good shake to oxygenate it. I didn't get video of it because I needed 2 hands to do it, but here's a clip of what it looks like after the shaking for what it's worth. I get the yeast starter of Yeast 1968 ready, and I pitch the yeast. Then I put the carboy into my fermentation fridge, and this is why I use that specific sized and shaped carboy. I can add 2 of these into the fridge and close the door. I didn't have to do any modifications on this fridge. I didn't have to take the door off and put wooden extensions like you've probably seen for larger 5 to 6 gallon carboys. These fit in perfectly. Even with a little wiggle room, it's not causing any tension on the door or the hinges. It shuts nicely, and there's still room behind those for 2 1-gallon batches if I want to ferment something at the same temperature that those beers are fermenting at. I did add a carboy cap and a blow-off tube, and the cap is a little loose. I tape it down with some 1-inch wide electrical tape, giving it a bit of a stretch as I wrap it around. I'll swap out that orange cap for a rubber stopper and an airlock in about 5 days. And I use an Inkbird temperature controller to control this fridge. So with some rubber bands and a small piece of thermal insulation, I hold that sensor close to the surface of the carboy. And just to hammer home the efficiency of that tri-coil immersion chiller, the carboy is going in at a temperature lower than my target. And that's okay, because that temperature will rise soon enough. And now I let the yeast do its thing for about 10 days to 2 weeks, and then I plan to cold crash. And I don't just simply move this carboy into a colder fridge or drop the temperature on the fridge that it's in. I take some steps to try to avoid any oxygen that I can from the volume reduction cooling this carboy and this wort is going to do. And I think it's, I don't know if it's a technical term, it's typically called suckback on forums and books and whatnot. As I'm trying to keep it from sucking oxygen in, I want it to suck in CO2. And here's what I do to try to make it pull only CO2, or at least more CO2 than O2. First, I mix up a bit of sanitizer and add a small funnel in a cup. I grab a balloon, and I bought, I think, 100 of these balloons for $10 at bargainballoons.com. I bought more than I'll ever need for like 10 cents a pop. They were super cheap, and they happened to have all the letters on sale, so I bought B&Bs for Big Monster Brewing, although you never actually see these balloons, but I know I did it, I guess. And I prep these balloons by cutting off the fill stem and then pulling out the plastic valve inside. And then I put a decent amount of sanitizer in. I don't fill a balloon with sanitizer. That is, I guess you could do that to make sure you have everything covered. But I put in just enough so I can slosh it around, turn it, and make sure there's a good amount of contact time with the sanitizer on the inside of that balloon. I empty out that sanitizer, and I fill the balloon about a third of the way with CO2. and I tape on a piece of plastic tubing that I also sanitize, and then I swap out the airlock for that balloon, and in this case, I am moving the fermenter into a colder fridge to cold crash for at least 48 hours. We're still not done. There is a lot of work after brewing and getting the beer into a glass, as I'm finding out as I put together my notes and do this presentation in this episode. Now we're on to kegging. First, I disassemble the keg and sanitize everything, and then I mix up a good amount of sanitizer inside the keg. While those pieces sit, I fill up another carboy with hot water so I can flush the lines that I'll be using to transfer the beer. I use a racking cane and a Blickman quick carb pump to transfer the beer to a keg. I pump hot water through all of this first to flush out any dust or critters that might be lurking since the last time I let this stuff sit and rest from my last transfer. And then I do that same process again, but this time with sanitizer that I mix up in that carboy. To prep for the transfer, I purge as much oxygen I can from the keg by pumping in some CO2. At this point, I bring out the beer, I add the racking cane to the beer, and before I connect the keg, I pump out a little bit of the beer to flush out the lines of any air and sanitizer, and to dump out any tube that I might have hit when I put that racking cane into the carboy. Now I create a closed loop by connecting the racking line to the liquid post of the keg, and connecting the gas post of the keg to the second valve on that carboy cap. The incoming liquid should push most of the CO2 back into the carboy, limiting additional oxygen exposure to the beer as it transfers. I finally start pumping the beer, and we can see here it's a pretty quick process. And at the end, I empty the lines into a small sample glass so I can see where we're at on this beer. And then I do that entire flushing process again that started this time with PBW, followed with hot water, and then I just hang everything to dry in my brewing area in the garage. Now we're on to the quick carbing, and I was going to end here, but I realized I say that every video. I always say I carbonated with the Blickman Quick Carb, and then go on to the tasting. So I'm going to go through it quick. This is probably something that can be in its own video, but I felt like it really should be added since I say it every other video. So let's take a look at that real quick here. The start of this for me is much like the process of racking the beer into the keg. I set up the quick carb and I run some hot water through it to flush any dust or anything that was in it that may have gotten in it since the last use. One tip that I've learned the hard way is to have something to hold these hoses in place when you're planning to walk away from this so you don't turn around to a soaked kitchen. After the hot water flush, I do the same thing with Star San and sanitize the line, pump, and the carbonation stem. I disassembled some quick connects and added sanitizer in a bowl to let those sit for a minute. Now I'm ready to connect the liquid line and drain the sanitizer and some of the sediment that might be at the bottom of the keg, much like I do with the start of the racking out of the carboy. I connect the gas line, which is the return line for the quick carb, and I look at the carbonation chart to see what PSI I need the gas at. This beer's at 39 degrees. I want about 2.5 volumes of CO2. The chart shows that I need 13 PSI, and according to the quick carb instructions, I also need to add 2 more PSI, so I start the gas at 15 PSI. I start up the pump and turn on the gas, and I see that the gas is hitting the beer right away, and that's good, so now we just wait. As far as how long I run the Blickman Quick Carb, the instructions do give you a set amount of time, but it's based on a 5-gallon volume. I did write Blickman support and told them I'd be using this mostly on a 2.5 gallon, sometimes 1 gallon batches, and they gave me the formula of 12.5 minutes per gallon plus 5 minutes. So in this case, that comes out to 35 minutes. I add another 5 minutes the first few times I use this as a precaution, and that actually worked out really well, so I've not changed it. So I do this for 40 minutes on all my 2.5 gallon batches. It seems to work really well. It's one of those, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I haven't messed with it much. It's one of those very lucky first time out tries that worked out. So that's my suggestion if you're in the same situation. About halfway through the process, I do increase another 1 to 2 more PSI to compensate for the rising temperature in the kitchen. And now, thanks to a tip shared by the Short Circuit Brewers channel, I also bleed off a little bit of the pressure to let the gas start saturating again. When I'm done, I remove the quick disconnects, empty the lines into a sample glass, and check out what we got. For this beer, I am canning it all and enjoying it on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and New Year's Eve with some friends, but I'm going to stop there. Canning is much like the quick carb, can be a much longer, isolated, detailed video, and this one is really long as it is. I did not realize how much work goes into getting the beer to the glass after the brewing to this, and it actually really made me think of how to break this up into even more detailed videos in the future. This is a good exercise, I think, for me. Might not have been so good to watch. I hope it was in some case, or at least to some degree. But canning, I'm going to say, plus the fact that there may be a really good chance that people watching this video are getting the same canner I got for Christmas, or at least maybe one by the same manufacturer. And I think that's worth spending some time on its own video. So canning will come later. Let's see how this year's Feats of Strength came out. All right, let us get to tasting. First, I want to talk about the label. Hopefully that's coming in focus, because I made a similar label on the bottle last year, but the what would you call it? The sticker, the paper I made it out of did not last. It came all wrinkled, couldn't read it, and you couldn't see. This is the same exact image I used of Frank Costanza on that year's Feats of Strength, and you couldn't see it. I fixed that. You can see it. You can read my favorite quote from that episode. And I have the government warning, the little homebrew thing to try to make it look semi-pro. I didn't know what to put on this side, so I put a checklist of feats of what to do for Festivus this year. And I don't know that tilting it and holding it like that in the camera was a good idea. I guess we're going to find out. So this is freshly canned. I mean, hours ago. Freshly canned. I put the label on right away. Somehow it's still holding on. This bottle condensation was nuts. I kept drying it with a towel the whole time ahead of peeling down the sticker, and it's actually staying on pretty well in this. What I like is that these are waterproof, so I just rubbed my hand all over that and nothing came off. Finally happy with some can labels. But that's enough about the can. I said I wasn't going to talk about canning. Let's get to the beer. Alrighty. See if I can do a pour here in front of the camera. Now, I don't have any left from last year to compare it directly to. I think this is darker from my memory. I'll have to go back and look at the video. I'm not sure. I do think it's a little hazier, and I chalked that up to I was way behind starting this, so maybe I didn't get to find it and clear it and rest it as long as possible. But there's no particular malt or anything that would do that, and certainly the Brewing Fonce would not make it hazy. But let's get to the tasting, well, the whole experience. Again, I can smell those mulling spices right off the bat. Clove, the cinnamon, little bit of punch, a little brightness from the orange peel. And then I get that dark, not dark, but that brown ale character just underneath all that. The taste is pretty on what I expected. There was one thing I didn't mention, since we were talking more about the work involved with it rather than the actual brewing process. One major mistake, I don't know if you'd call it that, I'll explain in a second here, that I made was been using the foundry for over a year since this last beer, and then beyond that, I've dialed in the process and increased my efficiency quite a bit. So with that, the starting gravity on this was significantly higher than the first one, which means there was more sugars to ferment. I pitched a little more yeast, and the yeast went nuts this year. So it ended a little lower than last year. So it started higher, ended lower. You can see where this is going. This is a much boozier version than my last one, which is okay. I like it. I knew that was going to happen, and I kind of tasted it as I went along the way in those sample cups. But I kind of missed the sweet, bready, cookie-like thing of the first one. So I kind of have to readjust my recipe next year for that new efficiency so I don't get as much sugars. And even if it dries a little lower, at least it won't be quite as boozy. That is the first thing I noticed on that sip, is it is boozy. I think it went from about 5.5% to 7%, which isn't boozy in and of itself, but for this beer is boozy. But let's get with the other taste here real quick. I will say that booziness and the dryness of it is a very dry finish. Kind of mutes that brown malt flavor that I added specifically to get that cookie taste. That is kind of gone this year. It's going right to the flavors that come out of the spices and the sweet of the cookie. I do miss that kind of homemade baked good taste that the brown malt added. And I think it's because it's being overshadowed by that dryness and that sweetness. Maybe as it warms up and maybe as it ages, it'll be a little more, but I don't think I'm going to have much to age with the parties coming up or the gatherings. They're not huge parties. And I only have, it's 2.5 gallon batch. I only have 22 cans. That's not a lot, even when you get like just 6 or more people together. So aging might be out of the question, but still a good drink if it stays coolish here in Central Florida during the holidays, and by that I mean the mid 50s. This will be nice. The booziness will be nice to have in that cool weather. If it gets to a 75-degree night, this might be a little much, but I enjoy it. I like making this every year. It is a once a year beer, and this one's a little bigger version. Next year I know what to do to try to dial that back, and maybe even throw in more brown malt to get that kind of fresh baked goods thing that was a real surprise last time I made this. So not a disappointment, just different. And that's it. I think this was probably by far the longest episode I've put out. So thank you for hanging in there. I wanted to do something different since this is a beer I already made, and I didn't realize how much I haven't talked about before. So I'll talk about more of what we just did in detail in later videos. If there's something in there you want to see, please put it in the comments. I'll be happy to take that in consideration for the next video I make, or next set of videos. I will be back with one soon. It's right behind this. I also just canned that beer too, so I know it's ready to go. So, all right, went on way long enough. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in that next episode.